Thanks, Tony. It's a great pleasure to be here today. And I'm not resentful in the least that I'm last speaker on the last session. So I just want everyone to know that. So my the topic I was asked to present on today is the role of middle powers in the South China Sea. And I've chosen to focus on three non-claimants: Australia, Indonesia, and South Korea. So just to take a step back, middle powers can be defined as a category of states that place a premium on rules-based orders and institutions to constrain the tendency of major powers to ride roughshod over the preferences of smaller states in international relations. In a material sense, middle powers are those states, approximately 20 to 25 of them, that possess the capabilities and standing to shape outcomes in the global governance sphere when acting in concert with like-minded states. Three prominent middle powers, Australia, Indonesia and South Korea, are all non-claimant states in the South China Sea dispute. But they all share concerns about China's conduct in the region, particularly with respect to potential inhibitions on freedom of navigation resulting from attempts by Beijing to enforce its claims in the region. So the question I've been asked to address is, should these three non-claimant middle powers be doing more to foster stability and to fulfil a mediation role among claimants, including China, in the South China Sea? So what I want to do in the next 15 minutes or so is discuss what's at stake for these three countries, Australia, South Korea and Indonesia, before addressing this question. The three non-claimant countries take no formal position on territorial disputes in the South China Sea, but as was evident in each of these countries' response to the PCA ruling earlier this year, they share the position that freedom of navigation must be preserved and existing international agreements observed. So what really distinguishes each country's position is the extent to which they're willing to press the importance of these principles in their interactions with China. I think Ewan yesterday covered off really well on Australia's posture and its behaviour in relation to the South China Sea. So I'm going to skip over. I'm going to talk very briefly about Australia, but reserve most of my remarks for Indonesia and South Korea. So in the South China Sea, we know that Australia has been an outspoken critic of China's approach to territorial disputes with other claimant states. Coalition and Labor governments in this country have repeatedly stressed what they see as the inviolability of freedom of navigation in the South China Sea, in effect repudiating Beijing's 9- claim, although I learned today that it's actually a 10- claim, which was interesting. Insofar as Australia has sought to build bridges with other countries on the South China Sea issue, this has been confined largely to a joint statement with the US and Japan on the PCA decision following the annual trilateral strategic dialogue meeting in July this year. The TSD statement, which was roundly condemned by China, I might add, came on the heels of ASEAN's failure to mention the PCA ruling in its annual ministerial meeting communique. There's minimal evidence, at least evidence that I've seen, that Australia has engaged in any attempt to craft a regional coalition of non-claimant middle powers to mediate the South China Sea dispute between China and other claimant states. Apart from well-canvassed fissures within ASEAN, coupled with Australia's quite poor track record in sponsoring multilateral initiatives in Southeast Asia, such an attempt would risk alienating Washington, which is reflexively suspicious of allies looking to mediate disputes in which the US has a clear preference. Likewise, there are few grounds for assuming Beijing would be open to such a role for Australia or indeed any other middle powers in the region. Turning to Indonesia. Historically, China has viewed Indonesia as primus inter pares in ASEAN. Since the 1950s, Indonesia's size, its geostrategic location and its non-aligned status have incentivised China's elites to place the relationship on a sustainable footing. In recent years, however, Indonesian views of China's role in the region have soured somewhat. As China's economic presence in Indonesia has increased, nationalist concerns have hardened around what some see as the threat emanating from cheap Chinese imports and the adverse impact of these on the Indonesian manufacturing sector. These economic concerns are reinforced by growing strategic worries over China's increasingly assertive posture in the South China Sea. Maritime security, we know, remains absolutely vital to Indonesian strategic policy. And as Anne-Marie Murphy has argued, virtually all aspects of China's threat to Indonesia, control over waterways and exclusive economic zones, the sanctity of international law, ASEAN cohesion, and the centrality of ASEAN in broader regional institutions, are challenged on the South China Sea issue. Now, Jakarta's primary concern over the South China Sea issue pertains, as we heard yesterday, to the overlap of China's 9-line claim with Indonesia's EEZ around the Natuna archipelago. Indonesia's willingness to openly challenge China on this issue has become more salient under President Joko Widodo, who has reasserted territorial sovereignty as the centrepiece of Indonesian strategic and foreign policy. But the value to Indonesia of the maritime zones surrounding the Natuna Islands isn't just symbolic. One Indonesian scholar has pointed out that the East Natuna block zone is estimated to contain one of the world's largest gas reserves at around 46 trillion cubic feet. Although Beijing concedes that the Natuna Islands belong to Indonesia, the intersection of significant symbolic and material considerations for Jakarta and the waterways surrounding these islands provides Indonesia with a strong motive to reject China's 9-line claim over the South China Sea. This has been underscored by Jakarta's robust response to the incursion of Chinese fishing and Coast Guard vessels into its EEZ waters around Natuna, which has witnessed exchanges of gunfire and allegations from Chinese authorities that Indonesian Navy ships have rammed Chinese vessels. Designed to send a direct signal to Beijing about the value Jakarta places on the issue, in June this year, following the latest confrontation, President Widodo chaired a cabinet meeting on board an Indonesian warship stationed in the Natuna Islands. Indonesia has also been a major beneficiary of the Obama administration's initiative to advance the maritime capabilities of Southeast Asian states, with over $20 million of US funding earmarked for financial year 15-16 to, quote, enhance the Indonesian government's ability to protect its maritime areas, safeguard its natural resources, and contribute to regional security and stability. What about South Korea? Well, we know that South Korea has quite a complex and complicated relationship with China, and this, I argue, inevitably shapes Seoul's approach to the South China Sea issue. Unlike fellow middle power non-claimants Australia and Indonesia, Seoul's position with respect to the South China Sea issue has been low-key. The ROK's established position has been that it supports freedom of navigation in the region but takes no sides in any of the territorial disputes. This is, strictly speaking, the same as the respective positions taken by Jakarta and Canberra. But Seoul's evident preference has been to avoid stating this publicly. It appears that only after pressure from Washington in 2015 did the Park Geun-hye administration call for the demilitarisation, quote unquote, of the South China Sea and specify that, quote, China must guarantee the right of free navigation and flight, unquote. Instances of public US pressure include President Obama's statement in a joint media conference with President Park in October last year that he expected South Korea, quote, not to break rank over criticising Chinese behaviour. This followed high-profile comments by the US Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and the Pacific, Danny Russell, earlier in 2015, that Seoul should, quote, speak out as a major stakeholder regarding events in the South China Sea. There are two plausible explanations for South Korea's evident reluctance to be more engaged in the South China Sea issue, despite the fact that it does have significant trade. In 2014 alone, $1.1 billion worth of trade for South Korea traversed the South China Sea. 86% of its oil imports traverses these waters. So South Korea has significant skin in the game. The first explanation is, and the most obvious, is that South Korean policymakers are aware that siding with the US and publicly criticising China over something as crucial to Beijing as territorial sovereignty would probably result in China making life more difficult for the ROK on the Korean Peninsula. And this is the primary security issue for South Korean elites. The second explanation for Seoul's reluctance may be the status of the disputed Liancourt Rocks, the Dokdo Islands for South Korea, Takashima Islands for Japan. Seoul has rejected Japanese overtures for a joint submission to the ICJ to rule on the issue, arguing there is no legal case because the territory is administered by the ROK. End of story. Seoul is almost certainly aware that by challenging analogous Chinese claims with respect to islands in the South China Sea, it may in effect be undermining its own case for territorial sovereignty in Northeast Asia. So to summarise, while like-minded middle powers have successfully built coalitions to address vexing global policy challenges in areas as diverse as arms control and the environment, there are few grounds to conclude this is possible in the South China Sea. South Korea, as I've argued, is understandably preoccupied with its own immediate strategic environment in Northeast Asia, and Seoul's preference is to retain a low profile on South China Sea issues. Policymakers are mindful of the potential for Beijing to exploit linkage diplomacy by making Seoul's circumstances more difficult on the Korean Peninsula, and only pressure from Washington seems to have driven South Korea's public engagement on the South China Sea issue. By contrast, Indonesia, while strictly a non-claimant state, has territorial skin in the game due to China's 9-line claim overlapping with the waterways surrounding the Natuna archipelago. The scope for Jakarta to mediate the different positions within ASEAN has narrowed since the divisive ministerial summit in 2012, and as China has hardened its position on territorial issues and sought to encourage differences among ASEAN members. Australia, for its part, also has minimal room for middle power manoeuvre on the South China Sea, aligning itself increasingly with the US approach, although so far demurring from undertaking joint phone-ops with American forces, and having earned the ire of Beijing on several occasions, very public and very pointed ire of Beijing on several occasions, Australia is really in no position to play a mediating role in the South China Sea, as some have argued. If Asia's leading middle powers are not equipped or prepared to step up and play a mediating role in the South China Sea, does this mean they should step out of the way entirely? Of the three countries assessed in this paper, South Korea would be the most sanguine about having little to do with the issue, despite much of its trade, as I say, passing through key routes in the South China Sea. For reasons of geography, overlapping claims from China, ASEAN and Southeast Asia, Indonesia is a key player. Given the potency of the country's nationalism regarding territorial sovereignty and the foreign policy value placed on de facto leadership in Southeast Asia, Indonesia is likely to remain deeply engaged in asserting its position on the issue. Australia, for its part, has alliance interests in supporting the US, but it also has interests surrounding freedom of navigation that exist independent of the alliance. As an acutely trade-dependent nation, Australia relies on open access to overseas markets, ironically including China, for its economic prosperity. Any endeavour by China to impose conditions on freedom of navigation would be anathema to Australia's strategic interests. While Beijing has not declared an air defence identification zone in the South China Sea, for senior Australian policymakers, it's not hard to envisage how gradual acceptance of China's 9-line would seriously impede long-term national interests. For this reason alone, and for the foreseeable future, Australia will remain an active non-claimant in the South China Sea. Thanks.